This is Row Talk.
So this is another book chat episode. This time we'll be talking about the novel Hench by Natalie Zina Walschots. It was a 2021 Canada Reads CBC selection. So that's a simple competition where they have they televise 5 books and they have celebrities or well-known people defend them, and in the end one wins. This one did not win, but this was the most compelling one for me to read because I've been into superhero movies and stuff. So basically the premise of the book is it follows superheroes, or actually a hench person, a woman. I'm pretty sure in the book she identifies as a woman. There's like a tinge of LGBTQ plus feel in it. So I don't know. I hope I'm not misgendering or whatever, but I'm pretty sure they refer to her as she in here. And basically it's a hench person. She works for a villain, and something goes wrong and she has a vendetta against superheroes. So the whole book follows kind of from the hench person's perspective. And I mean, I think that's pretty good premise. Overall, I thought it was pretty good as a superhero movie, or a book, sorry. And I mean, I don't know what to say. It was a quick read. It was fast paced.
Yeah, it was. I really liked it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure if you've seen, there's been like a big blow up, I guess, or explosion of alternate superhero stories. I've noticed, like, The Boys, I think, was the one that kind of kicked it off. If you've seen that on Amazon Prime, it has a very like The Boys feel. And then also that Invincible TV show that just came out on Amazon Prime as well. It's got that feel for me, where like the heroes are heroes, but they are people as well. And obviously people plus power is usually a bad thing a lot of the time. And so you get bad people when you have superheroes. But yeah, it was like, I told you this when we were like texting about it, but I read this book in 3 sittings. It's like I think a 400-page book, almost on the dot. I think it was 399 pages. Yeah, 399 pages. So like I sat down and read like 150 pages basically every time I sat down to read it, because it was super, like, it was the opposite of the last book we read, The Water Knife, where instead of like this slow build up to get you understanding the world, and then like, you know, a powder keg, it goes off and everything happens. This was very much like a bunch of smaller powder kegs going off one after the other, leading up to the big thing, which is obviously a lot easier to read because you have that next little hit of dopamine or whatever as the next cool event happens. But I really liked it.
I like the pace, because like the writer, the choice of words and everything, it's not really introducing new ideas or events or settings. It's very simple. Like she might say, in the alleyway, so you can imagine whatever you want to be an alleyway. That's not an exact quote, but that's kind of the vibe I got. I didn't have to think about what I was reading. The images were pretty clear in my head, and whether it was accurate or not, it painted a good story in my head from sequence to sequence. And I think she drew on superhero lore for the settings and everything. And whenever you describe an action scene, like when someone just jumps in out of nowhere, you don't really have to describe it that much, because I mean, we've all seen it in movies. Someone just flies in from somewhere and they have a superhero landing. So
yeah, that's actually one thing I will say is Natalie here, like, she did a fantastic job of describing those events. Like you said, like, you don't need to go through a lot of detail to do it. So it can be quick, but the words you choose when you're describing it, like the wall collapsed versus the wall detonated, like that has a very different feel to it. And like the words she chose to describe those things were perfect. Like all the punch, like it almost felt very body horror-esque. Like the ending, which we're not doing spoilers yet, but the ending has some very body horror stuff. And even the beginning, the events that kind of lead up to her going on her journey, like even that has some weird body horror aspects to it where like I was uncomfortable reading it. But despite that, she wasn't being overly verbose. It wasn't like Tolkien where you're like reading the description of a tower and it's a page and a half, which has its place. But here it was like the description is a couple sentences, but the word choice is so good that you're like, holy, that was unnerving, or that was uncomfortable in a way that it is good. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. So yeah, like I really like that as well about it.
It had good snappy dialogue, especially between Anna and her friend, her best friend June, which you usually see, especially in the Marvel movies. They're generally rated for the entire family, but they have a lot of like quick back and forths, especially if you think of Tony Stark as Iron Man. He's known for those snarky comments.
The witty banter between like Captain America, like the good by the book guy, and then Tony Stark is the, you know, I want to do good however it needs to be done kind of thing. Yeah, it very much has that vibe to it as well. It's a very like superhero ebook. Like she plays on all those tropes, you know, like the main superhero, which is a weird thing because they're also the antagonist of the book. He's basically Superman. Like he is a trope, and intentionally so. I'm not sure if you want to like get into some of that stuff. We'll probably wait a little bit because it does have some spoilers, but he's intentionally a trope and she plays on that really, really, really well. She has this great understanding of the superhero genre. But
yeah, all right. Well, I mean, I think we can just get into it. I mean, overall, for me, it's definitely a reread. It's a fun reread, maybe in the summer, or if it's like a rainy day, or you're stuck in the house, or if you need some excitement, it's definitely a pick me up kind of book, literally, and you know, in terms of feelings. So yeah, I think overall I loved it.
I did too. It's a super fun, like easy, I guess, read, but not like the popcorn candy kind of like brain dead fiction. Like it's easy while still being complex and having a lot going on, and it's super, super cool.
Well, let's just get into the spoiler section. So spoiler warning, we'll be talking about the plot, story, everything. So I'll just say that a couple more times. Spoiler warning, spoiler warning.
Beep, 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 be aware. One thing that I thought was really cool about it, and you kind of touched on it, like the plot basically, something happens that makes this, they're called henches. I would presume because like the author is, like you mentioned, very like ingrained in the LGBT QA plus scene. And so hench person sounds clunky, but hench woman and hench man is misgendering in certain cases. So like just hench, I think, is a great way to approach it. And so when this hench has this bad experience with the superhero, it's all like math and spreadsheets. And she's like, oh, well, the math that's done, like he saved the mayor's son or whatever, but you know, X number of people died, there was this much property damage, these many people had injuries that cost this much on the healthcare system. And like she does all this math and she finds out like, holy, like we saved one life, but the cost was the equivalent of 18 lives. It's not like those 18 lives are any less valuable than this one life. Is that, you know, superheroes are the bad guys sort of thing. And it's an interesting take because it's something that I both buy into, but also don't buy into in a sense. Like, I'm not sure what your thoughts on it really quickly. Like my thoughts on that approach is yes. The 18 lives for the one is a bad thing. But at the same time, if these 18 people are actively adding bad to the world, kidnapping people, developing weapons, and bringing more bad into the world, like, are those lives ones that we necessarily want to save? And it's a very like interesting philosophical discussion that like I wasn't entirely able to rectify for the sake of like the book. It's very easy to suspend that disbelief and just buy into it, especially because the superheroes as they're portrayed in this book are not superheroes as they'd be portrayed in Marvel. Like, it's not like you have Spider-Man who is doing the right thing because he wants to do the right thing. you have superheroes doing it because they want the fame and the fortune and the glory of it all. And so when those are your superheroes, it's a lot easier to buy into that. But like in a Marvel
Yeah.
world, I don't know if I'd buy that conceit. However, it worked for this book. But yeah, like, did you have any issues with that or any thoughts on? Because it's like a
Uh,
central conceit of the whole book. If you don't buy that superheroes are bad, the
yeah.
protagonist is a villain the entire time. It's very hard to enjoy that, right? So
So first, I haven't watched The Boys or Invincible, but as far as this book, I didn't get the feeling that for the most part the superheroes were um like for doing it for the fame and stuff. Like for example, the main superhero Super Collider, who is the Superman analog, they kind of leave it at, oh, he wants to do quote unquote good, but just by doing that, it's the effect of being good. They look at the actions, like the number of life years lost, like specifically when saving the mayor's son, he kills or maims or has impacts on the hench in the that auditorium or whatever it is. So I don't know. In my opinion, the superhero and villain vibe was kind of kept intact, and they kind of resolved it at the end by showing that there was a personal history between Super Collider and
yeah,
Leviathan, and even their superiors or predecessors, Doc Proton and Entropy. I think that
yes,
was
Entropy. I couldn't remember his name, but you nailed it. Yep.
yeah. She was the. I mean, they didn't say the author didn't say specifically, but it felt like Entropy and Doc Proton were the like mother and father figure,
Yes.
and
And
had a
like
falling out.
maybe not biologically too, which was kind of interesting. It was like
Yeah.
the mother and father figure, emphasis on figure. I almost got the sense that they were the result of experiments from the government or something, or
Yeah.
some other thing, and that they were maybe made rather than uh, born. And like they say that a little bit. Um, so just so people know, Leviathan, you mentioned him very quickly. So the characters in the book, you have Super Collider, who is basically Superman without the ability to fly, as we find out a little bit later in the book.
Yeah.
But he is the antagonist, the bad guy, despite being a superhero. The good guys slash supervillains, which is a little bit confusing, is Leviathan is the boss, but the book is a first-person book through perspective of a character known as the Auditor.
Mm.
And so the Auditor is the girl who, at the beginning of the book, um, basically is at an event where another villain, not Leviathan, is unveiling his newest evil invention. And
The
Super
electric
Collider,
eel.
the electric eel, that was his name. Yeah. And he's kind of funny because he, actually, that, I don't want to get on a tangent. We can talk about that later. But
Okay.
yeah, so basically, he unveils his biggest thing, new invention. Super Collider shows up, kills a bunch of henchmen, absolutely shatters her leg to the point where she'll never walk without a cane again. And so she does the math on these life years lost, like we mentioned, and determines like, yeah, there was X number of life years lost to save Y number of life years, but the X is larger than the Y. And so she just determines that he did a bad thing. And so she's going to stop him. And then Leviathan, at first, she just does this as a blog where she's like complaining about it and saying, look at these guys are bad guys. And Leviathan notices and hires her. And so then what they do is they use social media and the internet and the court of public opinion to like, I don't want, like, I'm not sure if this is the word I'd use, but I kind of think it is, to cancel superheroes. And so they
Right.
expose like, superhero A is you know uh not faithful to his partner and he cheats on his partner and whatever else, and they expose that. And so the court of public opinion is like, man, these guys aren't these infallible superheroes that we see depicted in media. They are just like us and they're awful because they have human flaws. And so yeah, that's kind of like the gist of it. And I forget where I was going with that. um
Um, we were talking about
oh
the
yeah,
protagonists, antagonists.
yes. And so yeah, it kind of like flips the villain hero dichotomy on its head. which is the same thing that The Boys does. The Boys follows a group of people who want to stop the villain. They're the heroes, but the heroes are more clearly villains here. But yeah, it's cool because, like, you're right. When I said they do it for the fame and the fortune and the glory, I think you're right in the sense that they don't necessarily do it for that. They do it because they want to. However, they also say that like Super Collider's power comes from the belief that other people have in him. And I wasn't sure if that was literal or just like a placebo effect where he feels stronger and so he's more bold. But it was very interesting that like his power quite literally comes from the opinion that other people have of him. He is a manifestation of the world in a sense. And so it's super cool because at the end of the book, they rescue Leviathan and he is upset because they've defeated Super Collider. And so we can talk about all the other stuff, but basically he's beat, he's a ball of flesh, he's been distorted and destroyed. And the word that's used to describe Leviathan's reaction is grief. And similar to like the Batman Joker thing, where these guys need each other to operate. Leviathan's whole goal was stopping Super Collider, and Super Collider's whole goal was stopping Leviathan. When he finds out that Super Collider's done, defeated, he's legitimately upset, and he doesn't speak with the auditor for days because he's so upset. And then when he finally does come around to it, he's like, yes, you're right to do that. Now let's take on the draft, which is basically, I viewed this book. I very much, I read the author bio before reading the book, and the author bio talks about how she's a member of the LGBTQ community, how she's involved with like, you know, that whole scene a little bit. And the book is very much colored that way. And so I viewed Super Collider as toxic masculinity in a way. He is strong and tough and bold. He does the good thing. He's the best thing in society's eyes and whatever else. And he's very much like, his powers are indestructibility, super strength. And that's what he's respected for. And it gives him his power, but it's also very destructive, just like toxic masculinity is. And so if Super Collider is toxic masculinity, the draft is like the system that creates that toxic masculinity. It's the, like going back to maybe a familiar language, it's the systemic racism, but for toxic masculinity. And so Leviathan wants to go in and just take out everyone who's responsible for even creating superheroes. And so the auditor, her reaction is, in her head, she's like, does the math. And she's like, we just took away so many life years and it wasn't really worth it. But she's like, I'll run the numbers. And so you see that at the end of the day, even if it's not necessarily what is best, because it's what Leviathan thinks is best, that's what he's going to do. And so he is still a bad guy. He's still selfish. He still wants to do things that aren't necessarily a net benefit in the perspective of life years. And so it still resets him to being the bad guy at the end of the book. And so you have this kind of feeling of like, man, I was cheering for the villain this entire time. But you also have this like, but the good guy was also the villain. And so you're stuck kind of like a little bit of a defeatist outlook, which I didn't love, but I can respect, I guess.
I interpreted Super Collider's power as more of a figurative thing. That's just how I read it, that he has the power to jump, be strong, do all that. But like if no one believes in him, it's like, why bother? What's the point of doing everything? And
that's another good outlook.
And I mean, I just read it basically as a superhero movie, or book, sorry.
Yeah, and like, did you read the author bio just before you?
No, I I knew
See,
nothing about the author when I was reading the book.
and that's the thing, is like I almost wish that I did what you did and just read the book once through without knowing about that, because like I read it before I even read the first page, and it colored like my entire view of the book. And I was worried that I was sort of like dating the author a bit and inserting what, like projecting my view of her views into the book and kind of ruining it a little bit for myself. So yeah, like I'm curious, like how did you view the book having known nothing about her? Because you said it was like a superhero novel and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I viewed it as, so what I have learned from superhero media, whether it's books or novels, I mean graphic novels or novels, movies, TV shows, and everything eventually it comes back to family, whether it's related or like a Justice League or Avengers, some kind of group. So I was waiting for that to happen, and I wasn't disappointed in this book. Like I figured Super Collider and Leviathan had some history. That's usually how it ends up. And then I was just waiting for, all right, what created their falling out? And the falling out was literally created by someone falling, which was entropy, I believe, and or maybe it was jumping.
That's, yeah, I didn't catch on to that. That's a good point. You're right. Like the falling out was literal falling.
Yeah. So that cemented like the adversarial relationship between the two. And then Doc Proton was like it gave the vibe that he was Super Collider, but now he has wisdom and perspective. And he's in an old folks home for superheroes. And they even say like, if they bust him out and they're worried that they have to get him back or something because he doesn't have his medicine.
Yeah, he has dementia, like he doesn't really know where he is. Yeah, that's, and
So,
yeah, it shows like how far Super Collider could fall as well.
So in the end, for me, it was a family tale. Yeah, I didn't read too much into that, but I'm curious, what about the author's bio had you thinking in this perspective? Like, did she say what the allegory was for the novel, or that's just what you interpreted based on what you read about her?
Yeah, so it's what I interpreted, what I read about her. So just I'll read you a little bit of the blurb from the back. But it says this specifically says like Natalie sits on the board of Dames Making Games, which is a space for queer and gender marginalized people to create games freely. She's a video game designer, where she hosts interactive narrative workshops. She lives in Toronto, 5 cats, blah, 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 blah. A bunch of other really cool stuff. Like one thing that cracked me up, she said she is, and then in brackets, unfortunately, the author of 2 books of poetry, which I very much relate to because I've written some terrible poetry in my time. But yeah, so because of like, I read that and like queer and gender marginalized. And then also very early in the book, characters are introduced as being in that space. There's characters who have same-sex relationships. The auditor, who is I believe, like you said, like genders herself as female. She sees a female driver and talks about how she's a crush on her. There's a bunch of this LGBT stuff, all LGBTQ stuff, all throughout the book. And it's done in a really like a way that I really like, which is just dropped in there like it's normal. There's no like fanfare about it. And so because of that, and because it was all throughout the book, that was kind of how I approached this narrative. And so like, I'll go on a bit of a rant about how I see it. You have Super Collider, which I said in my mind is toxic masculinity. He's like, they say at one point, he's 6'4", corded muscle, incredible strength, can't be like, can't be killed, bulletproof, can fly, we think, which I'll touch on in a minute. A whole bunch of stuff. He is the definition of like, that idea of toxic masculinity where men aren't taught to be in touch with their feelings, which Super Collider isn't. They're selfish and blah, blah, blah. The definition of toxic masculinity we're all familiar with.
Well, why don't we just define it quickly?
Yeah, sure. I'll look up, I am terrible at quickly defining things, as I'm sure you've picked up by the way I'm speaking.
Or maybe it's like yeah, I mean, all my what I have interpreted as a definition is just like if you're basically so like if you're in the top whatever percent of aggressive people, it's like
Yes.
you're just like, I mean, I can't even define it, so I'm not exactly sure what it is.
Yeah, the big thing, my understanding of toxic masculinity, the big thing is that it's toxic not just to the people experiencing it, but to the person enacting it. So,
Mm,
like it's toxic to men as well, in the sense that men are taught to be tough, not express their feelings, and that is hurtful to them because then they have internalized trauma where they're not dealing with their emotions or expressing themselves in the way they should. And that leads to them expressing themselves in other ways, be that, um, anger, frustration, physical violence, a bunch of things. And so that's harmful to them, but it's harmful to the fabric of society as a whole, because
oh,
we
okay.
have an entire class of people, 49, I think, percent of the world, that if this is how they behave, they can't even communicate. So that's why, like, that to me is like the core concept of toxic masculinity. It's that it's
Oh,
harmful
okay.
to both sides of the people experiencing it and enacting it. And that is true of Super Collider as well, right? Like he
Mm,
um, is harmful to society as a whole, the life years thing that we've talked about. But he's also harmful to himself because like he exists solely as a manifestation of society. Like he doesn't know how to exist without being a superhero. And they say that in the book
yeah.
a couple times. They say like all he knows is being a superhero and that's all he can be. So it's harmful to him as well. And so that's kind of why I saw him as toxic masculinity. At the same time, he has his like Wonder Woman uh,
um,
counterpart, quantum entanglement. And
yes.
she is to me the feminine side, because I think the biggest way to capture this is at the end of the book, she takes one of his legs, and her ability is basically she can
Uh,
manipulate space time
yeah.
and quantum fields. And so she, with all her power, basically collapses one of Super Collider's legs into his body. So it's like mushed together into a blob. And so they're like, oh, like he'll be fine. He can fly. And she's like, no, like he can jump. He needs some help staying afloat. And
That was
so,
funny. Yeah.
yeah, he may be Superman, but he can't fly. Like he just does the toxic parts of it. He has the strength, the violence. He doesn't have the more
Mm,
finessed parts of the superpowers. That comes from her ability to manipulate quantum fields and keep him in the air. But
right.
no one in the media and the world knows this. And so the feminine side is being forced to be pushed down, not expressed, and the masculine takes the credit, which is another kind of problem there as well. And so in the novel, quantum entanglement changes sides. And so she is exposed to how awful Super Collider is because Super Collider kills um, the person she was in love with because she doesn't love him.
Oh,
She's
yeah.
basically trapped in this. And so she, to get revenge, teams up with the protagonists and Leviathan and stuff to defeat Super Collider. And so you see this feminine side stand up for itself for the first time, and it is more powerful. It's capable of defeating Super Collider because it is a fully fleshed out human where she has not just superpowers, but she has empathy where she can work together with other people, not take all the
Mm,
credit. And, it was Auditor's plan, but quantum entanglement's powers that made it possible. And so it's sort of a commentary on how the masculine and the way it interacts in our world is problematic,
mm.
and how we can maybe, you know, access the more feminine from society's point of view aspects of ourselves to create better, more well-rounded humans. So I thought that
Well,
was an
I
interesting
can
take on the book.
I can see your argument now. I mean, I didn't think about it, but just based on, so we can look at a couple of things based on the names of these characters. And so specifically, we learned that Super Collider cannot fly, and he can jump, but he can pretend to fly when quantum entanglement is literally lifting him up and keeping him afloat. So that's a, I can see the argument there for, you have your feminine side holding up the masculine side without giving credit. And secondly, Super Collider, the name, it to me it just creates an image of I'll just run through everything. I don't care what
Yep.
wall there is. Kind of like
It's a good
Juggernaut
point.
from the X-Men.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly like that.
and then quantum entanglement is aptly named because she's entangled with super collider at
Yeah, that's true.
quantum level or whatever you want to call it, and then she disentangles herself, I guess, if that's a word.
Yeah.
um, and then
And
looking
she
at
disentangles herself from him in an emotional state, but in a physical way, entangles
oh
Super
yeah
Collider.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah
definitely.
yeah, his name becomes a joke of itself. Like
Definitely.
he's just a ball of body horror by that point. And Leviathan is aptly named because Leviathan is like unshakable, unbeatable. It's an image of like almighty whatever. And
Yeah, he's like a
he,
god in certain like ancients of like Mesopotamia, the Leviathan is literally a godlike creature, but also very mysterious.
yeah, finally you have the auditor who, if you think about an auditor, what they're supposed to do is have an impartial look at the goings on of a company, or in
Yep.
this case, the relationship between good and evil and heroes and villains. So she's labeled auditor, but it's quite clear she wants to get entangled with Leviathan, but is unsure about that too. So
Yeah.
that's probably set up for a sequel, and that'll probably be explored if there is a sequel.
Yeah, I'm curious to see that if she does go like because this is a very well-contained story. Like it's done. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a series. She could never write another book. And I would be well, I wouldn't be happy because I want to read more of her writing, but I would be satisfied. Um, but she does leave the door open for a sequel where they could talk about them going after the draft. Um,
Mm,
and I think it'd be interesting because, like she says, going after the draft isn't necessarily a good thing to do from a life years perspective. And so we
yeah.
could explore like her struggle with she wants to be entangled with, and like it's implied that she has feelings and loves Leviathan, but she has to rectify that with this life years. Is he actually a good person, or was he only good because she was the enemy of her enemy kind of idea?
Yeah, it seems to me Super Collider and Leviathan are the idea of good and evil. Like they're pretty, it's pretty clear. Like their boundaries of character is defined pretty clearly. There's a little give for Leviathan at the end where he's like, yeah, you were right to do that. But like the core of him doesn't change throughout the novel. The core of Super Collider doesn't change. Quantum entanglement changes. The auditor obviously changes. It seems
The
like
female
most other
characters change.
characters. Oh yeah, okay. I didn't notice about that. Yeah.
Yeah, like I
Yeah, you're
didn't
right.
notice till you said it, but you're right. Like um the male characters don't change. Even when I think Dave was her male friend's name. She had two
Uh
friends from before.
Greg.
Greg, that's what it was. Greg doesn't change either, but June does. Super Collider doesn't, but Quantum Entanglement does. Leviathan
Oh yeah.
doesn't, but the Auditor does. Um, the men are very stuck in their ways. The females are capable of evolving, um, which is, I think, an interesting thing because, like, Leviathan, I wouldn't necessarily consider him a boy or a man, or because he
Yeah,
is,
he's not human anymore, basically.
yeah, and like throughout the book for the first like 2/3, you think that he's wearing this suit, the super high tech suit of like bio scales that will shift and reflect light. And he talks with like mandibles, and his eyes are all jet black and bug like. And you assume it's a suit. And then there's this big twist, and you find out that no, that's his skin. And so he is not even necessarily human. Um, he's this like inhuman figure of evil that Super Collider has to stop. But all Super Collider knows how to do to stop him is to super collide, like you said, to just
Yeah.
charge at him head first. And Leviathan is so full of anger and hatred and bitterness that he can't even listen to the auditor, and he has to do things his way. And so like they have two different types of toxic masculinity just hitting each other, unchanging for decades, hurting the world and doing nothing to solve the problem. And it's not until the feminine side of those characters who are Auditor and Quantum Entanglement are able to express themselves, change, and come up with some kind of solution that, you know, Super Collider can be defeated, turned into a blob of flesh that can no longer hurt the world. And Leviathan's eyes are open and he says, like, what's the quote here at the very end? Where he literally says to her, like, you were right. I am through getting in your way, Auditor, because he recognizes that what she has is good. And so he sort of does kind of change, although I wouldn't even necessarily consider it change in the sense that he resolves his issues. He just recognizes that he has issues and is able to step aside and let someone who doesn't step in the way. So it's, yeah, like super interesting in that sense, where like you have these characters that you said don't change, just unresolving, hurting the world until other people can come in and solve it. But yeah,
It's at that time she earns the name the Auditor when Leviathan's like, you got this, you know, you do
Yep.
you, and you've already proved it. Let's go on to the next thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And she gets that name. And it's cool because like doesn't the name, I read this book in like mid to the end of June. So it's been a little bit since I read it. Isn't the name Auditor given to her by another superhero? Like a bad, because like they're
I
meeting with
believe,
a brother sister,
yeah.
and the brother is like a bit of a not a bit, he's a raging misogynist.
Yeah.
And he calls her the Auditor, and she sort of adopts that, if I remember correctly, as like her moniker.
It's also, yeah, it's been a while since I read it, but I believe that was the case. They invited the two heroes to Leviathan's compound. Then the guy was trying to hit on her for the whole time.
Yes,
and
that's what it was.
Later, I think her team or someone from her team just threw out the name Auditor or something, or I don't know how it came up, but yeah, I think someone was like, yeah, that fits, that's nice, and they all adopted it.
And so like she gets this name, but she doesn't pick it out. It's given to her from the interaction between her and superheroes. And then once she defeats one, and Leviathan says like, I'm out of your way, and he symbolically like gives her, and you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like knights her sort of with the name Auditor, and she becomes that. And no, it was a super, super cool book. I'm a big fan of things that take familiar formulas, like the superhero formula, and twist them enough that it's fresh again, which is why like I really like The Boys as well, because it did the same thing. I mean, fantastic recommendation on your behalf, because I really loved it.
Well, in hindsight, after reading the book, I would characterize it as another superhero novel. But when you're reading it, it reminds me of watching The Dark Knight in theaters. It's a superhero Batman movie, but I don't know, it was just done so well and in a refreshing way.
It felt
at that time.
Yeah, it felt like there was more to it than just a superhero movie. Like you could take away the trappings of superherohood and just, you know, alter the plot obviously to work still with normal humans, and it would still be a fantastic story kind of thing. Whereas like you couldn't do that with a lot of like, I don't know, like a Thor movie. You can't get rid of the superhero aspects of a Thor movie and come out with an engaging story, because there's really nothing there besides that battle of good and evil and spectacle and power. This was like an examination of the human condition of the world we live in the same way that The Dark Knight was, where you have greed and what are people willing to do to get there. And so it made it a book that you can read as like a super fun, I'm going to the cottage, I'm sitting on the deck, I'm going to read this book in 3 days, I'm going to have a blast with all the cool language and descriptions and be done with it and forget about it. But you can also read it as something you can take a lesson from and think about how you behave and how the world works and adapt to that, in the same way that like all those friggin' books I had to read at King's when I was in school for English lit would as well.
So tying it back to The Dark Knight, this is a spoiler for The Dark Knight. There's a bit where Joker gives Batman the option to save Harvey Dent or what's her name? I forget.
I
Katie
can't
Holmes'
remember her name
character.
either, but it's his love interest.
Oh man, this is such a common
Yeah,
Batman person.
Batman, love interest, Dark Knight. Let's see what comes up.
It's not Selena Kyle. I think that's Catwoman.
Rachel
Rachel.
Dawes. That's
Oh,
her name.
okay. It's not what I was thinking. Anyway, he has to choose between saving Harvey Dent and Rachel Dawes. So the Joker tells him, all right, Harvey's at this location, Rachel's at this other location. So he goes to Rachel's location, but when he gets there, it's Harvey Dent. And then you're just like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's what the Joker would do.
Yep.
So that very, in a way, reminds me of what happens in this book, in which when they finally get to Leviathan, Quantum Entanglement sees he's still alive and she just disappears. So they explain later that I believe Quantum Entanglement told the auditor and her team they intend to keep Leviathan alive for whatever number of days. I think it was 21.
Yeah, he was
But
alive for 21 days, is what she said. Yeah.
but they later learned that the policy at the draft where they keep him in prison is to kill him within a day or something like that.
48
So
hours.
2 days. So they learn.
Yep.
So by learning about this, the auditor figures out, oh, like they cannot kill him. Like it's not exactly a great analogy, but it's that twist where I didn't see that coming at all.
I didn't either. And like they talk about it as well, but it also shows that like both the good guys and the bad guys are both neither good nor bad, because Quantum Entanglement knew about this protocol and lied to the auditor to basically get access to her resources to help her defeat Super Collider because she wanted revenge. And so this good superhero lies and gives these people false hope about someone being alive just so she can enact revenge on Super Collider, which is not a very heroic thing to do. Whereas the auditor also lied to Quantum Entanglement and said some stuff because she was kind of responsible for
Her
manipulating the
yeah.
situation so that Super Collider was put into a position where he would want to kill Quantum Entanglement's lover. And so they both lie to each other. They both do bad things to achieve a good goal. And so it shows like even the good requires bad. There's no good guy, bad guy dichotomy like there is in so many superhero novels where you're like, oh, Thanos is the bad guy. Well, even with Thanos, they kind of were smart enough to give him a bit of like, I understand where he's coming from, sort of. Yeah, like a lot of the time in superhero movies and media, it's always like the hero is the knight in shining armor and the bad guy is this so cliched over the top, like, you know, twiddling his fingers, like, I'm gonna blow up New York just because I want to. Like, there's no reason to his thing. So it was nice that everyone, the good guys, the protagonists, the antagonists, all were both good and bad. It lent a realistic shade to the book. But
yeah,
no, it was. I also love The
I
Office.
feel like we covered a lot.
We did. We covered, like a ton of stuff. It was a fantastic book. I don't know what else to say about it, to be honest.
There was a part they mentioned that at the draft, I believe they screen all young kids.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. It wasn't really a big part of the story, but that makes you think everyone is screened basically. So you find some powers and you try to make them a hero, but that of course begs the question, well, like, how do villains become villains? Like, do they avoid the screening? In Leviathan's case, it's just things don't go right. They leave the draft and they do their own thing.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, every single person is basically subjected to that. I think they actually say that every person is subjected to it. So and that's something I didn't actually think about. That's a super interesting question. I'd love to read like a short story or something set in this world about that. But like how supervillains are formed. Are they people who escaped the draft testing? Were they people who were drafted and like were caught as having superpowers, but then they, you know, became, jaded with the process and broke out and escaped. Are people allowed to escape? Like, it seems dangerous to like have people that they nurture and teach them how to use these powers, but then they don't have control of them afterwards. So like, are these superheroes just government agents at that stage? Can you trust the government? What happens when you like, there's so many questions that actually just raised in my mind that like now I'm curious about. Cause like, yeah, like, is the draft a UN organization? Is it an American
Oh,
organization? Is there an equivalent draft in whatever, Russia or China or some big boogeyman across the sea kind of thing? Yeah,
mm.
there's a whole bunch of like potential for uh, Miss Walschots here to write short stories and more novels in this world, because there's a ton of cool stuff I'd love to see.
Yeah, I think we covered the main points, and now it would just be kind of the minutia of the story. Like, for example, when the auditor, before she's the auditor, when she's at her friend's apartment, recovering from her shattered leg, um, that's when she's kind of going through the days of drugs, recovery, and
Yeah, doing the
putting all
physio and
her
then just
attention.
running numbers to figure out the
Yeah,
life year math. Yeah,
which feels like the result of like a fever dream kind of. It's like that's all she has to keep going, because like her whole world has changed from um, being a hench. Now she actually has a reason to like hate super collider specifically, or heroes, and it's that kind of inspires her to do her spreadsheets and all that. So objectively, you can look at the spreadsheets and be like, yeah, I mean, there is life years lost when superheroes save the day, more more lost than what is saved by the superhero. But of course, then you have to think, well, what was the reason to come up with this spreadsheet? Obviously, it's her experience. So
yeah,
I think that was probably the most relatable part for me, because I don't know, I just spent a lot of time on the computer, and when you
yep.
get a good spreadsheet, I love spreadsheets.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that like exactly that. It was, if it wasn't for his actions, none of this would have happened. Like Super Collider did this to himself. Um,
Yeah.
and so like funnily enough, so it's August now. In
Yeah.
February, Kalista, my girlfriend who I live with, she slipped on the stairs going outside and fell and broke her leg.
Oh,
And
geez.
she actually had the same, not as severe as her, but she had a spiral fracture because, so she slipped and fell, and then she tried to stand up and didn't realize her leg was broken. And so she put weight on it and broke it in a second spot. And so I have
Oh,
lived through that process of having someone live with you. And like she was literally basically locked in a room because she couldn't walk. So if she wanted to go anywhere, I had to like get her crutches so that she could stand up and help her stand up. Or like we were
mm,
using my computer chair as like a makeshift wheelchair to roll her through the house. And like she went through some tough times, like not just physically, but mentally. And so
wow.
reading about that at the same time as her like going through it was super interesting, because this Natalie Walschots author, like she nailed that experience, like the
Oh, okay.
distress and the like you said, actually the fever dreaminess of it all. Like that was what Kalista went through for a bit. So like it was a super accurate representation, which is, I think, like I don't know another way to say it. I'm going to sound like such a zoomer when I do, but like a low key strength of the book, like it was very low key
Yeah.
strength, was just how well she described situations that I would assume she hasn't been in, because most of them are impossible. Things like someone blowing through a wall and,
Yeah.
snapping her leg in half kind of thing. And yeah, like so good was just the way that she wrote. I loved it. It was so engaging. The sentence structure was like short and long, and it wasn't just the same like number of syllables every sentence. And it was, I don't know, it was super, super cool to read. Super
Yeah,
engaging.
the non-superhero parts were believable. It's like I've said these things. I've talked to people like this. I know someone who broke part of their leg or tore their
Yeah.
ACL. I've seen recovery. Like a long time ago, my sister tore her ACL and meniscus. So I
Oh,
was there for
jeez.
her recovery. So you can see, like, you can see this the pain and the struggle on
Oh
people's
yeah.
faces when they're and have a severe injury. And yeah, I mean, it's believable in the sense that I've literally watched something like that happen. And also the dialogue, it's not verbose, it's
It's
like
very
there are
realistic
inside
banter.
jokes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. That's another one is the talk, the actual conversations, like you said, were like
Yeah.
it felt like realistic dialogue. There was also like one of my pet peeves in books is exposition. Like I really hate books. There's like one book that I read was called Snow Crash. Um,
Mhm.
and it's like lauded as one of the best works of like cyberpunk fiction ever. And I didn't like it because there's constant scenes where like the guy goes and the librarian character just explains things to him. And it was like
Oh.
super frustrating to read because they're just like telling you Sumerian myth. And I'm like, I don't want to read this. And like, and I can't think of like a single expositional passage in this book. Everything was explained via plot events or like secondary dialogue. Like even the
Mm.
hench, um, like contractor temp agency thing, and the
Oh yeah.
fact that like superheroes and supervillains were contracting out henches, like that was explained in such a way that like it was easy to understand very quickly without being like the year is 2021 and superheroes and villains were like it was, which is a hard thing to do. It's one of like super hard to do. So I was super impressed with that as well. And it kept the book as like a super easy and fun read, every single
Yeah.
section of it throughout the entire book.
I think, in my opinion, the reason that's the case is the setting is modern. Like, it's a modern book. It's a This novel is released in an entertainment climate of superhero movies and media, so it's like it's already on most people's mind. If
Yeah,
whoever
like
picks up this
everyone
book,
has that lexicon to speak quote unquote the superhero language. So she doesn't
yeah,
have to spend time explaining, like going back to our water knife book, what clear sacks are or
yeah, yeah,
how the arcology towers work. She doesn't have that burden of proof to basically sit down and explain this all to the reader. They already understand superheroes are people with powers and villains are the same thing, but they want to do
yeah.
bad stuff. And yeah, it's a good
Yeah, she's
point.
just picking up on the hench part of it. It's kind of like, it kind of reminds me of the minions from the Despicable Me
Despicable Me.
movies,
Yeah, that's true.
but
Yeah.
they're basically like a comedic tool. Here it's like, all right, this is a superhero setting, but we have temp agencies, and then someone's superpower is smelling really effectively,
Yeah, that was hilarious. Yeah.
which is like, yeah, I buy that. It's like some people smell better, have better ability to smell than others.
Yeah.
Um, so that feels like it would be a natural superpower, quote unquote. Like, I'm sure there's people in the world who are like that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Um, and yeah, and then the other thing is that Anna had her own cab driver, like a hench cab driver. That was a
Yeah.
cool part that kept
Yeah.
me in. So small details like that were fleshed out the role of the hench and the world. But once you get halfway through the book, it's like, yeah, this is a superhero story.
Yeah. Like the beginning is robust enough with its details that you immediately like buy into the world. And then
Yeah.
you can get away with doing crazy superhero stuff because that suspension of disbelief is already there. It's been set up so well in the first half.
Yeah, and then the last thing that I have in my notes is I just read someone's review, and one line that stood out was they called it a novel about a young woman's professional development. So in that way, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So you're a part-time gig worker, you get hurt, you carve out a role for yourself, and then you're second in command, basically. I mean, that
That's
was interesting.
hilarious. I didn't think of that, but that's super true. And I actually like, so she works in game design and whatever else. So obviously the process for working at a game design company and like the company that I work at is very similar because it's software development. We're just not making games, we're making less exciting stuff. Um, and the way that she like spoke and talked about how the office was run like even that had a type of like like an Office Space style comedy to it, where I was like relating to her, and the way that like I like so and so just was sitting there behind his monitor with 14 like cups of coffee, all various states of finished, where like all of that was just added so much detail, like just the perfect amount of grounded, like this is me as an adult just reading this book kind of thing to it.
Yeah,
That it really like
the
made
eel
me
likes
buy
to be
in.
called E. Hi
Yeah,
E, how are
yeah,
you?
hi
Are you
E.
well?
And then like he makes her, it's at the very beginning, like the only reason she's even at that event to have her leg broken in the first place and set it all off is because he just wanted female representation at his press conference. So he like
Oh,
invites her and she's like, oh, like great, like he's seeing my all my hard work as a temp and like he's really respecting me, like he's gonna get me to come, I'm moving up. And then he gets there and like you need to stand right beside him, and it's like, oh, like he just, I'm
oh
only
yeah,
here because I'm a girl, not because of my merit. And so like he's just
yeah.
the shitty stuff that goes on in offices. And then because of that, she now Superclutter shows up, breaks her leg, sets into the events. The entire process and emotion of this book, like if he just wasn't a misogynistic asshole who just wants like good press, so he's going to get this girl to show up, none of this would have happened. Like all that is super funny.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's basically all I have about that. So yeah, it was a good read.
Yeah, it really was. I don't have much else to talk about either. Like I think we touched on pretty much everything. But yeah, no, I loved it. Good book. Really enjoyed it.
Right, cool. That was Hench by Natalie Zina Walschots, 2021 Canada Reads finalist. Um, yeah, check it out if you
Yeah.
have the means.
Yeah, and if you want to get a feel for what it might be like without actually like investing a ton of time into reading it, watch like an episode or two of The Boys or Invincible on Amazon Prime.
Oh, yeah.
Super similar feel, and if that's something that you like, definitely get this book because it's like an amalgamation of Office Space, The Boys, and like Steven Universe, which is like a cartoon. It's like it's all that combined. It's super cool. Yeah, recommend it if you're looking for a fun read or you're looking for just like a cool examination of maybe gender roles. I don't know. Read it. It's really good.
This is Row Talk.